Welcome back to Quick Book Looks. We're headed into the holiday season, so we're doing a Christmas themed mystery. This one is 11 Pipers Piping by C.C. Benison. It is the second in a series. The first one is 12 Drummers Drumming. It features Father Tom Christmas, who is a clerical sleuth. Chapter 1. Did they not feed you after the wedding, Mr. Christmas? I dropped into the reception for only a minute, Tom replied, conscious of the passing figure of his housekeeper as he continued his contemplation of the bounty in the vicarage refrigerator. I didn't have a chance for a bite. He barely knew the couple he had married that afternoon, Tom and Gemma, other than to have a brief preparatory discussion with them the month before. He had never seen them in church, nor had he seen their families or friends, and didn't expect to see them again unless the couple wished their baby baptized, which might not be far off given that the bride, wearing a meringue with a train half a mile long, had fairly waddled up the aisle at St. Paul's, the second of the two churches in his charge. Her plump face, when she'd pushed back her embroidered veil, had looked much like a blazing beetroot, he recalled, staring at a jar of the pickled variety inside the door of the fridge. Sweat had sparkled in tiny beads along her exposed hairline, this despite the glacial damp of the nave in January, which some might have construed as the effect of energy expended getting up the aisle, but which Tom interpreted as a dew born of anticipation and triumph. The groom, however, had been a figure of bemusement, his face a kind of Belisha beacon, one moment as blanched as that leftover rice pudding in its puddle of cream on the second shelf, the next as pink as the Virginia ham one shelf below. Tom shouldn't have fancied their chances at marital success. They were much too young. He was a farm laborer and she was a health care aide of some sort, and they were living with his parents. But for some reason he did, and could only chalk it up to a decade's experience splicing couples of varied sorts. He imagined them receiving their 60th anniversary card from the Queen, or the King, as would most probably be then, when other couples more advantaged would fall by the wayside. When betrothal is brief, the marriage lasts long, he recalled his father-in-law saying, quoting some bit of Jewish wisdom when he was trying to reconcile himself to his daughter's elopement. How wrong he had been, at least in Tom and Elizabeth's case. The reception was at the Pig's Barrel, Tom told his housekeeper. A January wedding and a pub reception. Sounds a hurried affair. A little, perhaps, Tom responded noncommittally. He rarely went to wedding receptions anyways, unless he knew the family well. Receptions could murder the best part of Saturday afternoons, and it wasn't as though he didn't have anything else to do. Polish his sermons, for instance. He dropped in at Todd and Gemma's only because he'd seen the very attractive village bobby, Marie White, pass through the barrel doors when he went for his car after the ceremony, and couldn't resist the allure of a chance encounter. But alas, when he arrived, Marie was ensconced back to him at a table full of, damn, men. Anyway, snow, ominously forecasted to bung up northwestern Europe for the weekend, and more was beginning to fall in earnest, and so getting home to Thornford seemed more imperative than being stood like a lemon at the Pig's Barrel. He looked past the edge of the refrigerator door, wondering if Madrin was about to launch into a mini inquisition over the newlyweds. Customarily, she would have ushered them into the vicarage study when they came for their marriage interview, but the wedding had come together all in a rush during busy Christmas week, which Madrin had spent with her aging mother in Cornwall, thus depriving her of an opportunity to expect and pass verdict on events at home. But Madrin's back was to him. He could see one hand resting against one cheek as she contemplated the array of cookery books marshaled behind the glass of a ceiling-high barrister bookcase. He guessed her preoccupation lay not with the hapless couple. The Sunday before, after her return from Cornwall to Thornford Regis early in the new year, she had cooked a joint, accompanied with roast potatoes and parsnips, green beans with caramelized shallots, and a coarse Yorkshire pudding. Tom and Miranda had been in the sitting room with their guests, Will and Carolyn Moore, their daughter Ariel, their son Adam, and his girlfriend Tamara, when their conversation had been riven by a piercing cry, such as he had never heard before, from the kitchen. Heart racing, expecting to find Madrin horribly burned or cut, Tom dashed into the kitchen, the others at his heels. Instead, they found her, oven-gloved, staring aghast into a steaming dish, the door of the aga behind her a yawning maw. Nestled inside the dish's black and aged side was a vast and even expanse of tawny gold, quite lovely to look at and smelling heavenly. Despite his still coursing adrenaline, he had felt his stomach growl. And then Miranda, on tiptoe, glanced into the pan and declared, "Oh, it's a drop dead." A kind of moan slipped from Madron's throat as she turned and placed the hot dish onto a trivet at her work table, next to the roasted beef and several bowls of thawing berries, which a little later spilled around a heavenly pavlova. "But I'm sure it will taste wonderfully," Caroline had interjected, and the others had murmured concurrence. Drop dead was his daughter Miranda's coinage for a Yorkshire pudding that failed to rise. Her mother's often hadn't. Lisbeth had been blasé sort of cook whose Sunday lunches were sometimes a fiesta of Waitrose ready meals. When Lisbeth died, their French au pair, Ghislaine, tried her hand at English fare, but could never quite get the knack of certain dishes, Yorkshire pud among them. Tom, who had never made one in his life, couldn't understand how a simple concoction of eggs, milk, and flour could be so temperamental and cause so much distress. There had been much crestfallenness back in Bristol when the Yorkshire, pulled from the oven, looked more like a Norfolk in a pan than a Staffordshire in a pan, flat rather than hilly. Lisbeth would feign indifference, but Ghislaine wept at her first failure. But then they were all in shock in the wake of Lisbeth's sudden violent death. Madron, on the other hand, were always a tremendous success, puffy and light, glorious umber hillocks set against da- deep golden valleys, a sponge to sop the rich brown gravy she would produce from the organic beef acquired from the farm shop at Thornbarton. But not last Sunday. The pud simply looked sad. After her initial distress, she had pulled herself together and brought forth an otherwise fine Sunday lunch in the dining room, although she remained subdued throughout. Since then, she'd had Fred Pike, the village handyman, in to look at the aga, which Fred had pronounced fit as feather on a duck, scrutinized the sell-by dates of the flour and milk, and had a Barney with Roger Pattamore down at Pattamore's, the village shop, over the freshness of his eggs. She had adjusted Tom to check on his computer She had adjured Tom to check on his computer to see if there were any chat rooms or forums devoted to Yorkshire pudding. The word failures didn't pass Madron's lips. Mysteries was substituted. There were a few, not unpredictably in the internet age, but he had white lied and said there weren't because, and this he didn't say out loud, for heaven's sakes, it was too silly. All this bother for a simple and not wholly necessary side dish. "You heat fat in the pan first, don't you?" Tom had asked a couple of days later when he found Madron lifting her glasses from the chain around her neck with one hand and pulling the very pan to her face in the other for close examination. "Then why don't you do a pudding now and experiment with some vegetable oil? That's a sort of fat, isn't it?" "Really, Mr. Christmas," Madron had snapped, her tone indicating the suggestion infradig. "It must be beef fat." And then her eyes shot open behind the lenses, and a flash of enlightenment lit up her features. "I shall have to have a strong word with the girls at the farm shop." Tom later learned from one of his parishioners that there had been some unpleasantness up at Thornbarton when Madron arrived at the shop to question the aging of their beef, or lack of aging, or some such thing. Salisbury had made a larger than usual food delivery to the vicarage on Thursday, so Tom suspected Madron and the women at the farm shop were keeping a bit of space between them for the time being. "Sometimes, Miss Prouse, things happen for no reason," Tom said finally, trying to keep exasperation from his voice. Madron flicked him a disapproving glance as if he were being theologically unsound, and said, "It's an omen. I feel it in my bones." Tom, who at the time was struggling to put the lead on Bumble preparatory to a walk up Knighton Lane, had bit his tongue and said nothing, because of course there was nothing to say. He was disinclined towards omens, particularly if they came in the form of collapsed savory puddings. Now his housekeeper had pushed back one of the glass doors of the bookcase and pulled out a cookery tome. Opening the book to the index at the back, she studied him for a moment over the rims of her spectacles. "You'll let all the cold out if you keep the refrigerator door open like that." "Yes, sorry." "You may be pleasantly surprised this evening, Mr. Christmas." Tom made a demurring noise as he closed the door. "Perhaps if I lined my stomach with a glass of milk." Mr. James Douglas used to love the burned suppers. I expect from his name, he had a bit of Scots in him. You don't have to be Scottish to enjoy the Burns supper. Oh, don't you? Tom thought. It might help. He didn't know who his natural parents were. He didn't feel somehow that could have been Scottish if one permitted to feel such things. He himself felt thoroughly English, and if he were about to give allegiance to another people, it would be the French or the Italians, who had wonderful food, not the Scots, who could only have been led by a ghastly climate and impoverished soil to think a celebratory dinner should consist of offal and oatmeal stuffed into a sheep's stomach, then boiled, turnips, his least favorite vegetable, boiled, and potatoes, yes, boiled. Without reopening the refrigerator door, he could see in his mind's eye the ham, the leftover cheese and onion pie, the last of the turkey orzo soup Kate had made after Christmas, any of which would make a fine Saturday evening meal. He was hardly fit for the pulpit the next morning, Madeline continued almost fondly, licking her thumb and turning a page. James Douglas, who preceded Tom, but for one an incumbent, had been vicar in the village for over 25 years before his death. A lifelong bachelor of considerable private means and Epicurean tastes, he installed Madeline as his housekeeper when she was a young woman, turned her into a superb cook, and left both the large late Georgian vicarage, which he bought outright from the church, and its housekeeper to his successors. Tom, therefore, had more or less inherited Madeline Prouse, who, though a spinster, retained the honorific Mrs. He was grateful for the help, being a busy priest and a widowed father, but there were moments when she did get on his wick a bit, especially when the matchless Mr. James Douglas slipped into conversation. He felt, to keep up, he should get as much malt whiskey as he could down his neck Saturday, then spend Sunday morning conducting services at two churches with a throbbing headache and a dry mouth, and trying not to gag over the communion wine. He didn't fancy it. In fact, he didn't fancy attending the Burns supper at all, but he was chaplain to a regional pipe band, and Roger Pattamore, the pipe sergeant, expected him to come and deliver the Selkirk grace. It was churlish to say no. Having been in Thornford less than a year and still finding his way in the parish, Tom didn't want to offend for small reasons. What he wasn't keen on was the food, the tatties and the neeps, potatoes and turnips so called, and the acme of culinary horrors, the haggis. When he had been a curate in Kennington, he had an old parishioner who told him that in Botswana, where he held some rank in the colonial administration, they had used haggis, or was it haggai, to poison hyenas. Really, Tom thought, he should have gone to that pub reception after all, and at least had a couple of greasy pasties. With such bricks in his stomach, he might have an excuse to only nibble at the forthcoming supper. He glanced at a couple of trays on the counter and wondered what was under the linen cloth covering them. He was about to step over and lift one when, unexpectedly, tantalizingly, the aroma of roasting meat tickled his nostrils. He began to wonder if hunger was driving him to fantasy. His glance moved to the oven. Am I smelling beef? Are you back up on that horse, Miss Prouse? Madron glanced up from the cookery book. I don't know what you mean. I thought you might be cooking a roast with a view to make a Yorkshire pudding. Well, it's true I'm cooking beef, but it's beef Wellington, of a kind. Beef Wellington? Tom gave a passing thought to his food budget. You're serving the children beef Wellington? It's an adaptation of beef Wellington, Madron frowned at something in her book. Minced beef, which I shape into a ball and roasted earlier. Now it's cooking enclosed in chopped mushrooms and puff pastry. It's en croûte, Daddy, a voice behind him said. Miranda had pushed open the kitchen door, followed by the vicarage cat, Powell and Gloria, who began a lewd and mewling pace in front of the Aga. Yes, en croûte, Madame Madron murmured. That's the word. We're having our own burnt supper, Miranda said brightly, moving to the counter to examine the contents of various bowls. I shaped the mince to look like a haggis, Madron explained. Tom frowned at his daughter. I'm surprised that you and Ariel and who else is coming to your sleepover? Emily and Becca have the faintest interest in Robbie Burns. Oh, we don't, or at least they don't, Miranda added obliquely. Then it's because of Zach Burns. Miranda shook her head so her pigtails slapped against her cheek. Tom turned to Madron helplessly. I believe he was the last winner on the X Factor. Madron raised a censorious eyebrow. It's because of Emily, Miranda shrugged. She thinks he's. Oh, blast, Tom thought. The word to follow was probably cute, hot, or cool. He sighed inwardly. There was something awfully cunning about Emily Swan. Perhaps having two older brothers and an older sister and living over a pub made her more worldly wise than the other two girls joining Miranda at the vicarage for her first sleepover. With a brother nearly a dozen years older moved away from home, Ariel Moore lived the life of an only child, like Miranda, while Becca Kife had lost her only brother to suicide in August, a terrible tragedy for the village, and it had, cruelly, made Becca into an only child too. Nice, Miranda said at last. Emily thinks he's nice. Nice seemed a good noncommittal word to latch onto, and Tom did. He couldn't help not wanting Miranda to leave the sweet, dreamlike realm of early childhood to be swallowed up in a schoolgirl pop star crushes with bedroom walls covered in posters of boys with peculiar haircuts and ludicrous trousers. Though, come to think of it, his bedroom, when he had been 10 years old, had been covered with posters of men with peculiar haircuts and ludicrous trousers. But all of them were magicians, and magic had been his passion in those days. It had led to a career in magic for a time, so at least his bedroom walls had not proved a waste of space, so to speak. He glanced at Miranda's furrowed little brow and wondered what she was passing through her furrowed little gray matter. And do you think Zach Burns is nice? Tom asked. Oh, he's okay, I suppose. He watched her reach into a bowl by the sink, pull out a finger of raw potato, and bite into its end. Are you making chips? He asked Madron, trying to keep yearning from his voice. A plate of hot chips slathered in salt and malt vinegar would go down a treat at this very moment. Yes, chips for tatties, she muttered over her cookery book. Then she looked up. You really can't expect little girls to want boiled potatoes, can you, Mr. Christmas? How gratifying to be schooled about children's taste when he had spent not a little time easing Madron into the notion that Miranda's nor his tastes did not run to Gordon Ramsay on a daily basis. So I suppose you could say your burnt supper is kind of a posh burgers and chips. Madron looked up again. Well, if you must. Then may I stay, please? Miranda giggled. Emily says no boys allowed. Except, presumably, for the specter of young Mr. Burns crowned with 15 minutes of fame, Tom grumped. Then what are you doing for neeps? I've made fruit crumble for pudding, Madron answered. Bramblies, bosque pears, whortleberries, blackberries, yewberries, bayberries, strawberries. I've had quite the run this week on the frozen berries I picked and put down in the fall. Clever Mrs. P. They'll never detect turnip in that. Tom was full of admiration. Madron looked enormously pleased, if enormous pleasure could be counted in slight upturning of the lips. Mind you don't say anything. She shook a warning finger at Miranda. I won't. Miranda paused, then raised her own finger to her lips. Well, I won't until after. After will do, I suppose. It's one way to have children eat their vegetables. She addressed Tom. But Tom's attention had been drawn to Miranda, who had skipped to the kitchen door and was looking through the glass into the garden. Papa, regarde la neige, n'est-elle pas merveilleuse? She said, falling into French, as she often did when she was excited. In the darkness of early evening in January, the farthest end of the sloping garden, where trees screened the mill pond in summer, seemed a void, soft and black, but where light spilled from the vicarage window, demarcating the base of the old pear tree and two wicker chairs, all blazed white, diamond bright. Yes, it is marvelous, isn't it? He responded, joining Miranda to witness the thin veil of snow shimmering in the air. He put his hands on Miranda's shoulders and felt the straps of her dungarees. He could sense her anticipation. This would be her first full experience of snow, though in the garden outside it was neither particularly deep, patches of stiff grass were visible, nor terribly crisp, wet more like it, nor very even. The terrace had less than the lawn, but it might be before long if the weather folk read the signs and portents correctly. Shifting weather partly informed his unwillingness to tarry at the wedding reception at Pennycross. Temperatures had dropped through the afternoon, patchy ice had formed in the lanes between Pennycross and Thornford, and the landscape glimpsed between the hedgerows was bleached and undifferentiated in the watery winter light. Perhaps the snow wasn't so marvellous after all. Perhaps Madron had been right. A fallen Yorkshire doth herald tempest drear, or such like. His stomach growled in response to the thought of food. Lions and tigers, Daddy, said Miranda, whose ear brushed his shirt below his chest. You could hear that? I could hear it over here, Mr. Christmas. You could have a biscuit, I suppose, Madron began, making Tom feel not unlike Bumble, soon to be rewarded for being a good doggy. He turned. Madron was studying her watch. Or perhaps not. Best not to spoil your supper. Aren't you expected soon? Tom glanced at his own watch. Oh, yes, I suppose. Then he glanced again longingly at the fridge, a huge double-door chrome American model, surely the largest fridge in the village, outside the commercial one at the Church House Inn, and the Waterside Cafe, and the Thorn Court County Hotel. But isn't there much standing about first and drinking whiskey and the like? I wouldn't know. I've never been to a Burns supper. Startled, Tom was about to ask how she knew more than he what he was to expect from such an event, but Miranda interjected. Are they no girls allowed? They are, Madron replied stoutly. That's not fair, Miranda said. But yours is no boys allowed, Tom protested. Really, Daddy? Really, Mr. Christmas? Faced with remonstrations to what he thought was a reasonable observation, Tom backed down, supposing in a split second of reflection that most of human history was no girls allowed. Even Jesus, whom he thought a rather forward thinking chap, hadn't put a woman among his disciples. He was a bit snippy with his mother, too. Never mind, there's Bumble off his head. The sound of a frenzied Jack Russell barking could be heard on the other side of the kitchen door. Powell and Gloria stiffened into parodies of alert felines. Someone must be coming to the front door. Race you, he called to Miranda. And yet somehow Miranda made it to the front door first and pushed it open. Ariel Moore and Becca Kife seemed to pitch in on a gust of wind as Bumble darted between them and dashed into the front garden. Bumble, get in here, Tom shouted over their heads. But the dog, now a scurrying gray shadow against the black stone of the wall dividing the vicarage ground from church walk, had turned dervish in the novel ground cover. Tom could dimly make out four wiry legs wiggling in the air as Bumble turned his back in the snow and made happy growling noises. Bumble! Yes, Bumble, there's a good dog, called another voice, feminine but authoritative, clear and ringing, and Tom's attention turned to a shadow moving up the path, various soft shapes hanging from each hand. Caroline Moore emerged into a halo of light over the porch, her cap of fine, fair hair blazing almost as white as snow itself. In the same light, her pale, heart-shaped face and large, luminous blue eyes lent her a tentative, fragile air, but Tom had been deceived before by this tender vision. In his first week in Thornford, on an exploratory evening walk toward one of the green lanes that radiated from the village into the countryside, he had witnessed Caroline tear after, then tear into, politely but very firmly, a young man whose bull mastiff had followed the road and who had paid no heed to the bright red dog waste bin not 5 feet away, which the parish council provided. She had not seen Tom pass during the encounter, and he was glad, for she had been introduced to him earlier as a member of St. Nicholas' choir, and he simply couldn't remember her name, a hazard of early days in a new parish. The man with the mastiff had glimpsed him, however, and though they occasionally crossed the same path, the man always turned his head away, as if tugged by some string of embarrassed memory. Bumble, too, seemed to know the effect of her voice, for he flipped right side up at her command, darted over, and leapt up to imprint her camel coat with his damp paws. Stop it, Bumble! Inside! Tom commanded, and this time the dog obeyed him, inserting himself between the girls, who were taking off their jackets. Ooh, he's all wet! One of them shrieked. These are Ariel's, Caroline said, handing him a purple backpack and a rolling sleep bag. And these are Becca's. She handed him a second set, this one pink, then brushed some snow from her hair. Are you sure you're ready for this, Tom? I'm afraid it's Mrs. Prouse who will bear most of the burden of the sleepover. Tom dropped the girls' gear at the deacon's bench. I'm going to the Burns supper at your hotel. Of course, what was I thinking? Would you care to come in for something warm? I can't. I mustn't linger. I think I'm parked illegally in someone's spot. Oh, you drove the girls here. The hotel wasn't far up the road. I'm going into Totnes to join Adam and Tamara for supper. Tamara and her group are performing at the Civics Hall. Although if the snow keeps falling, I may have a sleepover of my own in town. Carolyn cast him a faltering smile. Anyway, it might be best to leave you males to your own devices. Burned suppers have a certain reputation. Perhaps, Tom responded lightheartedly, tugging at his dog's collar, their chaplain will be a restraining presence. A look of half-startled wariness seemed to cross Carolyn's face. She stared at Tom a moment, as if entertaining some private care. "Oh, I should doubt it," she responded at last, forcing an awkward laugh. "Carolyn," Tom began, puzzled by her response, "are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine." She paused. "I'm perhaps a little concerned about making my way to town. It was quite slippery coming around the lane a moment ago, and I wonder how the roads will be out of the village. I don't think I've seen so much snow outside of a ski holiday the family took in Switzerland before Ariel was born." Responding to the sound of her name, Ariel said, "Mummy, have you got my camera?" "Oh, yes, dear, it's right here." Carolyn reached into her coat pocket. "Now you remember what we talked about." "Yes, Mummy," Ariel said with a sigh. "And mind," Carolyn continued, bending down, drawing her daughter into her arms and lowering her voice, "how you behave towards Becca." "Yes, Mummy," Ariel sighed again, enduring her mother's hug. Carolyn held onto her daughter for a moment longer than the wriggling girl seemed to wish, then released her. "There, now be good." She rose and addressed Becca. "The pair of you. I'll be having Miss Prouse give you a full report." She gave a tentative smile as the girls, divested of their outwear, raced down the hall towards the sitting room. And speaking of Mrs. Prouse, any more fallout from the great Yorkshire debacle? "Oh, it's a puzzle being pondered at some length." Caroline's smile managed to widen. "I see. Anyway, I shall leave you to it. Best of luck." St. Nicholas's bell rang the quarter hour as she turned back toward the path, reminding Tom that 6:30 was the appointed time for the Burns supper to begin. Holding Bumble by his collar, he regarded the departing figure with disquiet. Through the demands of managing a hotel, Caroline carved out time to lend her rich, slightly breathy alto to the church choir, faithful to the Thursday evening practices and Sunday morning services, where her white robe and silvery blonde hair lent her an almost ethereal air. But lately she had episodes of missing both, excusing her absences lamely, uncharacteristically, usually some consequence of short staffing. She and Will had closed their hotel after Christmas for renovations to take advantage of the low season, and this had given Tom the opportunity to have them for a meal, in part a belated thanks to Will for organizing Race for the Roof, the half marathon fundraiser for the church in the autumn. But that afternoon, unexpectedly, for he had found them simpatico on both occasions, imagining that Lisbeth, if she had been alive, would have taken to the accomplished and astute Caroline, conversation had not flowed with particular ease. He had a sense of another conversation, private and passionate, adjourned to be resumed after tendering goodbyes at the vicarage door. At the table, Caroline had seemed to watch Will like a sparrow hawk. "Come on," he muttered to Bumble, closing the door. "We need to get you dry." He lifted the seat of the deacon's bench, pulled out an old bath towel, and began rubbing down the dog's rough coat. Looking up, he noted Madrin coming down the hall from the kitchen, bearing a tray with 4 fluted glasses containing what looked like champagne. "Surely, Mrs. Prouse, that isn't—" "Heavens, Mr. Christmas, of course it isn't." He followed Bumble into the sitting room where the 3 girls, minus the never on time Emily Swan, were gathered around the games table, which held 2 silver trays laden with Lilliputian versions of provender, tiny sausages, mini savory muffins, chicken goujons, grissini, baby quiches. He was about to reach for one of the pizza fingers when he heard someone, Madron, say, "Tut," followed by, "Those are for the girls, Mr. Christmas." Becky and Ariel regarded him warily over their flutes of ginger ale, as children might when confronted by a transgressing adult, particularly if that adult was a priest. He had an idea. He gently brushed his hand by Miranda's head, then exclaimed, "Look what I found! Miranda's got 10 pence behind her ear." "Oh, Daddy," Miranda groaned as he showed the coin to the others. Ariel and Becca's expression brightened with curiosity as Tom made quick movements with his hands. "Oh, look, the coin's disappeared. I wonder where it went. Perhaps Ariel has it behind her ear. Good heavens, yes. Only Ariel has 50p behind her ear." Ariel shrieked as Tom once again demonstrated the coin, then, with more brisk handiwork, caused it to disappear. When he pulled a 2-pound coin from Becca's ear, both girls chorused, "How did he do that?" "It's magic." "It isn't," Miranda said firmly. "It's a magic trick, then. Shall I teach it to you?" "Don't you have another engagement?" Madrin regarded him over the top of her glasses. Tom sighed ostentatiously and moved with theatrical reluctance across the rug as he might have done upon the stage. Yes, I suppose I do. Well, girls, enjoy your fine supper. Mrs. Prouse has outdone herself as usual. I pray I shall enjoy the humble meal that awaits me at the hotel. He turned into the hall and quickly crammed 3 pizza fingers into his mouth. Heaven! His heart and mind may have obeyed St. Paul's counsel to put away childish things when he gave up his career in magic for the priesthood, but for his stomach there were moments of apostasy. As the novel continues, Caroline's husband Will mysteriously dies in the darkened tower of the hotel after a flurry of a snowstorm. Who done it? We don't know, but if you choose to continue reading about Father Tom Christmas in 11 Pipers Piping, I hope you enjoy the mystery that you find there.